The Intel Corporation, known by most as just Intel, is a multinational company based out of Silicon Valley in Santa Clara, California. Founders Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore left their previous company, Fairchild Semiconductors, to start Intel in 1968. The original name was NM Electronics, but within a month they switched the name to Intel. Intel stands for Integrated Electronics, which is also the abbreviation for intelligence. Robert Noyce co-invented the integrated circuit by creating the silicon version we know today. It was based on the initial design by inventor Jack Kilby. The use of silicon in an improvement over the original germanium, which is where Silicon Valley eventually got its name. Gordon Moore made a prediction in 1965 that he later revised in 1975, that the number of components in the integrated circuit would double every 2 years. This prediction would later be known as Moore's Law. Although it is not a real law, it has become the target to meet in the semiconductor industry, spurring growth and advancement in many areas of technology. Both Noyce and Moore were in the group of 8 men who left the Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory to create the Fairchild Semiconductor in 1957, which they later left to found Intel. Intel's first product was the 3101 Schottky TTL, which was a 64-bit SRAM. It was close to double the speed of early diodes put out by Fairchild Semiconductors. Their goal was to eventually replace the magnetic core memory. One of 3 different technologies researched in its first year, Intel's 1101, the first high-volume metal oxide semiconductor memory and the first chip to use silicon gates. Although the development process was slow and frustrating, Intel stayed focused and eventually paid off. The technology developed for the 1101 became an industry standard and generated consistent revenue for Intel. It also showed the world Intel's capability at developing new and industry-changing technology. To accommodate its rapid growth, Intel purchased property in 1970. The company bought a 26-acre pear orchard to lay ground for their first location in Santa Clara, California. Employees moved into the location in 1971 following the completion of the newly constructed facilities. In 1971, it also became a publicly traded company with an initial public offering of $23.50 per share. This IPO raised $6.8 million for Intel. In 1970, Intel produced its first commercially available dynamic random access memory integrated circuit, the 1103. It was smaller and cheaper than the magnetic core memory, which caused it to have much success in replacing the magnetic core memory in many applications. It became the best-selling semiconductor memory chip in the world in 1972. While Intel set out with its focus on the semiconductor memory market, they understood the need to offer a multitude of products. In 1971, they introduced Intel's first attempt at a central processing unit in the Intel 4004. It was the first ever monolithic CPU fully integrated on one small chip to be offered commercially, paired with Intel's 4001 ROM and 4002 RAM and 4003 shaft registry. Small computers for various applications could be made. The 4004 was used in the first macro processor controlled pinball game. In 1972, Intel opened its first international manufacturing facility with an assembly plant in Penang, Malaysia. This was their first venture outside of the United States. Malaysia is now the host to many Intel operations. In 1972, Intel chose to enter the digital watch market with the purchase of a company called Microma Universal. This purchase led to the release of the Intel Microma, the first watch with a liquid crystal display. Unfortunately, technology had not reached the level to allow them to add more functionality to the watch, and they chose to focus on other endeavors. Intel also introduced the 8008 in 1972. This was the first ever 8-bit microprocessor and had twice the data width of its predecessor, the 4004. The concept arose from a contract with the Computer Terminal Corporation that was eventually abandoned by CTC. Intel continued to develop the chip, which became commercially successful and was the foundation for the Intel x86 series. Conceived and developed by Gary Kindle at Digital Research, PLM was created at Intel's request. PLM was the first high-level programming language for the microprocessor-based computers. Many Intel systems end up using PLM before it was no longer supported by Intel. In 1973, Intel opened its first wafer fabrication facility just outside Silicon Valley. It was the first facility where they introduced the white clean room suits, also known as the famous bunny suits. Intel also introduced the Intellect 440 software development tool. This was the first of Intellect systems, which at the time were pivotal to their microprocessor sales. The 8080 processor was developed in 1974 and had close to 10 times the processing power of its predecessors. Switching to a 40-pin package made the 8080 more versatile and easier to interface with. Many early arcade games, including Space Invaders, were built around the 8080. Intel continued its innovative approach in 1976 with the release of the world's first single-board computer, the ISBC 8010. That same year, they introduced the world's first microcontrollers capable of embedding intelligence into appliances, cars, and other electronics. Even with these two breakthroughs, Intel had time to improve upon the 8080 with its launch of the 8085. It was faster than the 880 with an improved power supply. "1977 saw more Intel developments, and in 1978 they celebrated 10 years and 10,000 employees. This is a far cry from the current 50 years and 107,000 Intel employees last year. The beginning of the 80s saw continued success for Intel. They had made it to the Fortune 500 list. Co-founder Robert Noyce received the National Medal of Science from President Jimmy Carter. Its newest microcontrollers topped the world's best-selling list, and Intel partnered with Xerox and DEC to create the Blue Book for Ethernet specifications. Ethernet has become a foundation for most wired communication technology, and Intel was a small but important part of its development. In 1981, IBM chose Intel's 8088 microprocessor for their PCs. The success of the IBM PC, paired with the decrease in profits from the semiconductor memory chip sector, caused Intel to change its focus from its original business plan to microprocessors. Intel launched the Intel 286 in 1982, which had 134,000 transistors, a marvelous feat considering their first chip, the Intel 4004, in 1971 only had 2,300 transistors. In the mid to late 80s, Intel was growing in leaps and bounds. Their annual revenue reached over $1 billion for the first time in the history of the company. They were also chosen as one of the 100 best companies to work for in America by the book of the same name. The 90s began with a heavy loss to Intel, the loss of Robert Noyce. The man who had such an influence over the entire tech world passed unexpectedly after suffering a heart attack. Despite this tragedy, Intel kept growing with more and more successes in the microprocessing market. The 2000s saw a change in Intel. They restructured the company and made moves to reduce their carbon footprint. This move was spurred by a consumer base more focused on green products. Even with the restructuring, Intel continued to innovate. Since 2010, Intel has acquired 22 companies in various sectors to continue its technological dominance. Despite the retirement of Intel's fifth CEO in 2013, they have seen record numbers over the last decade. Intel will continue to be a leader in the microprocessing market, as well as a shining example for other corporations with their community involvement and focus on staying green.